Alright guys, so I just want to do a quick overview of Scoring Synths and go over the GUI and kind of all the basic features and how to get started with this library. So let's start with the stabs here. All of the patches will load up in polyphonic mode by default, so I can play any number of notes at a time. Okay, so we sampled a bunch of true filter settings, and what I mean by that is we actually sampled individual steps of whatever the filter was doing on a given patch, so that we could take those tones that were generated by the filters and pump them out into the room and get all of those sounds as well, because it doesn't quite cut it to take the original sounds and just run them through context filters, because I think a lot of the character you get from the sound actually comes from modulating the filters on the Model D itself. So when you load up a patch, those will be triggered by velocity by default. So if I play the keys quietly, so you get the idea. But I added this feature with key switching that if you want to lock on to any given filter, you can do that with key switching. So if we click on the lower one here, right? And then we can just work our way up. And that can actually be quite useful because sometimes it's hard to hit the filter settings that you want and you want to just lock onto one. So of course you could just lock on to the top one, which has no filter being applied, and use context filters, which would be assigned to the mod wheel here. So let's take a listen to that. So obviously that gives you a little bit more control, but each, come with their own flavor, and I'd recommend playing around with all of those. So let's take a look at the features here on the GUI. You'll see we have a mixer, and then we've got a monophonic, polyphonic, glide control section, and then we've got two independent ADSRs. One is assigned to just the basic level, and then the other is assigned to a low pass filter. And then we've got further controls that will affect, the fine tuning, the MIDI transposition and octaving, and that's not a word, but and a velocity control, which will control dynamics, and a spread. And I'll get into all of these in just a minute, but let's start with the microphones here. So you heard what the DI sounds like. Let's check out some of the other microphones. So we've got a close mic. So you can already tell that sounds like quite a decent step back from right up in your face that the DI kind of offers. We've got a mid-room mic. Forgive my horrible playing, you guys get the idea. So the Deca has an independent center channel control. So if we load them up by default, the center channel will be automatically linked to the Deca mic. And if you want to adjust the center channel, you can do that. And then if you go back to adjust the Deca, it will lock back into place, but it'll retain the new balance that you just adjusted. And honestly, sometimes I like the sound of just the 2 mics in the tree. Let's check out the wides. So very cool sound. Surrounds. And I just realized that I'm playing only the top filter levels. So let's hear how some of these sound in the lower filter settings. Check out the rear surrounds. So adding a lot of character there. Each of the microphones has an independent pan control, which can be particularly useful with things like adjusting the DI and the close. Get this really wide sound, which I love. Okay, let's load up a few of these mics. I want to show you a control here. Right below the DI is a high-pass filter that is assigned only to the room mics, which I realize is a little bit confusing, but I'll explain the thought process in a minute. So when you pump out sounds into a room that have all sorts of frequencies extending down to 20 hertz and below, things can get kind of stuffy in the bass range when you start stacking multiple mic positions like this. So it's a big sound, but if you want a really controlled low end, what I'll do is sometimes pull up this high pass filter to pull out the sub frequencies in the room and just keep them in the DI. It's a bit much. Hear the difference. Of course, the DI is panned. Hear what I mean there? You can notice it there. It's like now the bass is really clean. So that's definitely worth playing around with. Let's take a look at these controls, which are not high pass filters. They are actually phase alignment controls. So sometimes you want the phase of the room mics to line up with the DI, especially in the case of percussive instruments where you start getting that flamming effect going on. But let me try and see if you can hear the difference with this patch. So without it on, with it on. It's extremely subtle, and I normally wouldn't use it with a patch like this, but I'll point it out when I get to a percussive patch where it's a lot more noticeable. But anyway, let's move forward to some of the other controls here. I'm going to close out of the room mics for a second. So when we're in polyphonic mode, you'll hear, you can get some overlap between notes unless you're really careful about how you're releasing each key, which can be messy, and sometimes you just want to keep it monophonic and that will behave a lot more like the Model D itself, which is monophonic. Let's hear how that sounds with the lower filter. So, you know, now we went from kind of like a stab to an actual usable bass sound, which I think is kind of cool. But let's keep looking at what we can do with this. There's a legato mode, which is a little bit more of a smooth transition. You don't get the attack. And portamento, which is the same thing as glide, essentially. Let's get out of the filter lock. So you get the idea. Key up trigger if you want to hold one note and, you know, trigger another note and have it go back to the first one. And note priority, which is kind of self-explanatory. So we've got a, let's let some of the mics up again here. We've got the ADSR controls. So the first one is just controlling level. And depending on the patch you're using, you can, you know, this will come in handy and serve many different purposes. But let's just check out the second one, which is assigned to a low pass filter. It's kind of cool. Now we're getting into kind of, you know, synthesizing territory. So people have been asking, well, what is it? Is it a sample library? Is it a synthesizer? And it's kind of both. It's mostly a sample library, but we've got some very basic features of a synthesizer. I mean, this is kind of like the basic functions that the Model D itself has, which is incredibly simple. But sometimes that's the way to go. So these controls here are fine-tuned. Let me, all right. Self-explanatory. I'll get more into these. They're incredibly useful when you start stacking different instances of stabs or plucks or whatever. I'll show you shortly, but real quick. So we've got a MIDI transposition control. We have a velocity control, which basically lets you exaggerate the dynamics. The synth itself really doesn't have dynamics in a sense, but we can adjust that within Contact. Make that as exaggerated as you want to. And that can be particularly useful when you're working with the orchestra, which is a very dynamic thing, obviously. So here we have spread control, which is more useful for like pads and things like that, but that will spread the DI left to right. So you've got a stereo sound, because when you're using, you know, just mono source material in polyphony, it doesn't sound very good if it's all in the center. So let's keep moving forward here. We have an arpeggiator, which is not particularly useful for a stab patch, but let's check it out anyway. It's actually kind of cool. I've got all the mics on. That's kind of... It's really amazing when you pull the mics out when you're used to having them on. It just sounds like all the soul is vacuumed out. Just gives it so much more depth. And honestly, guys, when you start fiddling around with the mics in an orchestral context, it's just so easy to get it to sit back and hear it on the stage, which is something that I, you know, struggle to do with reverb. It's not the same thing. So, real quickly, the arpeggiator is kind of straightforward. You know, you've got your different velocities here, and you can adjust the note orders. So I think right now I have it on up. So and they give you all sorts of patterns. I'm not going to go through them all, or you can do chords. So I'm just stacking octaves there, but you can do chords if you want to. Let's go back to up, and you got swing, all of that, release. So yeah, this can be really helpful to tighten up the arpeggiator. If you have the release all the way up, it's going to be a huge mess. So tighten that up. Much more usable sound, and let's just see how it sounds with a little bit of effects processing to give you an idea of what you can do with these patches moving forward. Pretty cool. And obviously, there's an infinite number of ways that you can process a sound like this, but that's just one of them to give you an idea. So why don't we check out the poly step as well, which is very similar. This kind of middle row here will affect the notes that are played, and the lower row will affect the velocity. And you can adjust the rate and all that stuff just like the arpeggiator. So let's check this out. And again, you can adjust the release to tighten it up or loosen it up. If you're gonna be more in the bass region, I'd keep it as tight as possible. And just for the sake of it, let's add some processing here again. Cool. Let's exit sound design territory for a minute and just go back to the basics again. So open up the main page here. Alright. So I'd say most of the patches in the library are in families. So what I mean by that are there are groups of similar patches that are designed to be layered with each other, right? So I'm going to unsolo this. Maybe I will keep that one muted. Let's start with these two. So we've got two variations of the stabs. So we've got different oscillator combos, and we're just going to layer these and see what kind of creative things we can do with these. So now instead of 3 oscillators, we've got 6. So let's take a listen. Right. So let's try just panning one left and one right. Cool. Let's do this. Let's put them back and start adjusting these fine-tuned controls. Octave. Turn mono mode on. Put the filters down. filters. Now let's start adding in the room. Let's do wide surround, Deca. Whoa, whoa there. That's a pretty powerful sound there. And you know, there's any number of combinations you can do. You could just, or you can pan these two and just use the room mics of the other one. Or we could do shit ton of room mics. Let's bring this down. We're getting a little bass heavy. Let's pull some of that out. That's a little excessive on the bass cut. Anyway, you guys get the idea. There are a million, maybe not a million. There are a lot of different options as far as how you can stack and layer these sounds. Let's add another one. We're talking 9 oscillators now. 9. That's pretty big sounding, and there's no effects on here, guys. It's like without effects. Let's throw a little reverb on there. I really like to use big dreamy reverbs, even with all of the built-in room sound you get with these recordings. You know, an Eventide black hole or a long lexicon, whatever you like, still sounds phenomenal on these synths. It sounds even better. Adding the room just gives it that depth you get from the early reflection mostly, and then it still takes extremely well to the long dreamy verbs. So let's check that out. That's just the DI mics. All right, I'm gonna do it, guys. Let's see how it sounds. Wow. Yeah, I'm loving that. Pretty awesome. I think I'm gonna turn the volume down a little bit here because it's clipping when I do. So just to kind of restate where we started, let's just go back to the DI. Let's take the verb off. Yeah. So listen to what we just played versus. You know, this is what you get out of a single Model D. And like I've stated before, this is never about emulating the real performance characteristics of a Model D. It's about taking that amazing tone and doing something that you can't do with a Model D. So it's a totally different animal, as you can hear. And adding the mics just adds a whole nother dimension to it. And guys, I really think it's special. For this overview, I know I just showed you 2 or 3 patches. There's over 100 patches, and they're all kind of stackable like this, and they all sound pretty cool, I think. So if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch directly or ask them on the forum, or you can send me an email at support@audioollie.com. That's fine too. And I look forward to talking with you guys. Thanks for watching. Bye.